So yeah, this is going to be talking about building codes, and I am not going to get into technical stuff on this one, right? I mean, that's kind of strange. Usually when we're talking building codes, we're talking technical. But as was introduced, I want to provide you guys some history and some perspective and some kind of pulse, if you will, of the building code industry. You can see here kind of just a collage of some vintage code books I have. As an educator and consultant, I'm heavy about research. And so I collect vintage code books. I've got quite a collection. So if you want to learn more about me and get links to all of the online articles I've written, I've got over 100 articles online at Fine Home Building, Journal Light Construction, etc., NADRA's blog. You can access those. I've got lists here on my website. You can go to glennmathewson.com, or you can go to buildingcodecollege.com. That's my online continuing education website. Click the office, and that's a way you can contact me there. And you can also see my bio again, that has links to all kinds of other information you can get to. So this is going to be fun. This is sort of the best slide I thought would be a good one to prompt sort of the entry before we really get going on this, especially in today's world. Is a little tough, you know. Being taught to avoid talking about politics and religion has led to a lack of understanding about politics and religion. And, you know, it's kind of similar to building codes in a way, except I'm actually putting this out there because I might bring up some politics or religion today. And remember, guys, the goal here is for us to be mature professionals and be able to have civil conversations about these difficult topics. So hold on to your hat, okay? Because we're going to talk about human shelter. And, you know, we all have very different expectations of human shelter. And isn't human shelter at the core of everything really what construction of homes is about? You know, everyone loves their survival shows, and we see them making shelter like this. So I love going to Google Images, and it's kind of a way to get a pulse of what people think of certain terms. It's just one of the things I do. It's not a perfect science. But if we go in here and we search human shelter, you can kind of see what we get. You know, it's really at that shelter level. We've got some affordable or some, you know, housing, homeless shelters. We've got some igloos. Obviously, we are at the bottom end here of just trying to protect humans from the element. But let's Google search housing, the term housing. And now, you know, look at the feel of what we get. We're into actual, you know, houses that we might actually be more proud to live in. But we're also seeing a lot of terms like affordable housing. We're seeing a lot of row homes. We're seeing very modest homes, right? Housing. We're a step up from shelter. And then I love when you put in the term new house. And look at the difference. Look at how we've increased these terms from shelter to housing to new construction. And, you know, I sometimes wonder, I live in a 1950s house. It was a tract home development from the post-World War II boom. And, you know, new houses they didn't quite look like this. You know, we had a different concept. And so what I'm showing you here is kind of one of the first things that'll be sort of a thread throughout my presentation today. Society's expectations. So society's expectations for a new house, well, here's your images. And so let's bring in the IRC. The IRC is the residential code. This is the one that's dominated the US, and it's the international code. And yes, people make jokes. Yes, it is actually adopted in places outside of the US. So it's not just Americans thinking, you know, like the World Series kind of thing. There are adoptions outside of the US, and that's the goal, is to provide good construction guidance so that folks can build shelter. But maybe not the level of shelter, maybe at the level of housing. And when you get to the level of new house, well, you know, you're kind of outside in some respects of needing this little cookbook for construction. And this is how I love to present the IRC, is that it really is a cookbook. More of this book is pre-engineered prescriptive designs, like a recipe for basic green bean casserole kind of house, right? And that's why you got the Better Home and Gardens and some basic cookbooks. And this IRC contains recipes, you know, from your grandfather and your grandmother from way back that are still allowed today, and we still see in construction today, especially the home inspection industry. You guys are seeing, you know, housing built over all of the different periods of society's expectations. Yet this code is also staying modernized and bringing in new recipes with new ways to build. And there's a lot less mandatory in here than there actually is optional recipes. So let's now talk about code, and let's go way back in time. Let's go to the first one that you hear people probably talk about. I'm sure you've heard of the code of the king of Hammurabi, or the king of Babylon, the code of Hammurabi. Now, the first edition of this code is a little bit hard to keep in my collection. It's on a stone tablet. I believe it's still in Iraq, perhaps at the moment. But I do have the second edition of the Code of Hammurabi. That's a ha-ha, you know, but it's hard to crack jokes here on the internet. But indeed, this was the second edition of the University of Chicago that was publishing this book, and I have the 1904 edition. And what's really cool is you get to see the Babylonian text on the left, translated to the English on the right. And here's that one that you've probably heard out there in the world, the first building code. If a builder build a house for a man and do not make its construction firm, and the house in which he has built collapses and causes the death of the owner of the house, that builder shall be put to death. And in case you kill the son, you can see the next one down there is, you know, you shall kill the son of the builder. And when it comes to the slave of the house, well, if the house collapses and kills the slave, you simply have to give another slave of equal value. I'm not sure how helpful that is because you don't have a house for the slave to work in. But this is a good taste of what code from a king is going to look like, right? It's very top down. It's essentially structural stability. I would say that's the first code that we had, was focused on structural stability. And this was a performance code. There's no recipe here to tell you how to do this, to help assist this man, this builder, in building this house. It's simply establishing the performance that's required. And if you fail that performance, well, then you've got your consequence. Now we can move on. I told you we were going to talk about religion, didn't I? I gave you the warning. Let's crack open Deuteronomy 22 here. And what do we have? We have number 8. When you build a new house, make a parapet around your roof so that you may not bring the guilt of bloodshed on your house if someone falls from the roof. So, you know, that, I don't know, is that arguably older? Well, this is in the, what, yeah, well, who knows? Let's see, what do we have here? That is fall protection, right? So I would say guards maybe is our second code that we ever saw come around. But I'd argue, really, I don't see anything there saying make a parapet so you keep someone from falling. So maybe it's really guilt protection, right? Because that seems to be the performance expectation, is the goal, the purpose of this code is about protecting your guilt, not protecting the person. Well, there's an example of what code would look like written from God, right? And you can reserve your opinions of the author. But let's move along, because parapet, right? If you look at parapet in the natural world, if you will, if you go to just normal definitions, indeed a parapet is a guard of sorts, right? To prevent you from falling over, to prevent you from getting shot by an arrow with the attack of the castle. But as you see in the photo I have here today, before you here, parapets are different in building codes. Parapets are about stopping a fire from one townhouse from catching the fire, catching the adjacent townhouse on fire. And of course, why do I have this old stock photo image here? It's because we don't build parapets anymore, at least not in Colorado where I'm at. These multi-housing units where you have, say, 5 families in this one building. Well, what are society's expectations? Society's expectations are that we have zoning ordinances in our cities. And we don't want to look like some trashy city with a bunch of multifamily and all these freaky parapets. And so it's the zoning ordinances across this country wanting it to look like one beautifully architecturally designed structure that essentially eliminate the parapets. And what we see used is an exception to parapets. The exception's almost the rule, and that's the fire retardant treated. Oh, I'm bordering on technical talk. The purpose of this is to show you the IRC is full of choices, but yet the old methods are still there. You can still build an extension of your firewall into a parapet for your fire separation between townhouses. But you can also do this. There's another method with drywall. If people just look at the code as a book of government mandates, and never open it up and explore it for themselves, they don't realize all of the enormous amount of free choices to the free public that they have. Well, let's move along a little bit in time and let's hop up to 1808. This is one of the prized pieces of my collection. It's the newspaper, the Washington Advertiser, from January of 1808. And in this, there is an article where the President of the United States and his declarations of building codes are reprinted. You can see that right here. Now, who's the President of the United States on the 17th day, October 1791? Those of you that appreciate American history are going to recognize how that date is really close to the birth of this nation. And that's George Washington was our president. And George Washington was writing codes for the city of Washington. And what was his codes? All outer walls of houses shall be made of brick or stone with slate or tile shingles. Yeah, that sounds like the code of a president, right? The one percenters. You know, though, they found, as you read further, it says, well, even though we knew that stone and brick and slate and tile would certainly eliminate the fires burning our cities down. I mean, that's the perfect solution. But this act, it was found to impede the settlement in the city of mechanics and others whose circumstances did not admit of erecting housing authorized by this act. And so what was it basically saying? Well, you know, the poor folks, the mechanics, the people running our cities, fixing them, you know, the blue collar jobs, they can't afford brick or stone. So lofty idea, George Washington, but, you know, it doesn't fit society's expectations. So if you read further in this article, because this is 1808, so we're in the realm of Thomas Jefferson's presidency at this point. And I think it's funny here what Thomas Jefferson is now writing. This is I, Thomas Jefferson, speaking. He says, you know, George Washington made these acts about wood frame construction, banning it, stone and brick. I'm just going to suspend those acts a little bit longer until the first day of the year, 1809. Now, why would this president push this decision off and just say, let's just hold this decision till next year? Well, because next year, James Madison would be president and he wouldn't have to deal with it anymore. And that's what it looks like when you get code from a president and from presidents. And what were these folks worried about? Fire safety, right? Because it doesn't look very good if your city is burning to the ground. And remember, these codes were written for the city of Washington, which now we call Washington, D.C. And that's the only city that the federal government and the president would be able to write a code for. But I'm getting ahead of myself. And so this was all about the best way to protect our cities from burning down is let's just build all out of wood or stone. Oh, but those damn mechanics don't have enough money for it. So they had to make some allowances for wood in there. And this is where I'll invite you later to go check out my YouTube video on this. It's 12 minutes long. It's only for the full level dorks. But it's where I take you through and I read you this newspaper, and then I compare these allowances for wood to the 2018 International Building Code, things like fire separation distance, maximum area, maximum heights, and type of construction. And it's amazing the correlation that you see between these. So that's for you dorks that want to really get deep into this history. And so, yes, those mechanics, you know what? They had lots of trees in North America, and it's real easy for us to pull those trees down and build ourselves some wood-framed shelter. Now, this is in Colorado. I used to do a bunch of four-wheeling way up into the Rocky Mountains, and this is a ghost town up there built in 1876. I just got a life insurance policy on my family, so I ran them up to the second floor to take a picture. I figured I'd test it out. That was another one of those cruel jokes. All right, but indeed, this is what we had readily available in America to make human shelter. But by gosh, it did create a bunch of fire problems for us. And so here's an addition on one of those houses. I just thought it's kind of a neat picture here. And you're looking at this addition from way back in the day. You can see there's been some remediation in trying to keep this ghost town alive. But what do we have here? We have 24-inch on center studs. We have a single top plate. And we have stacked framing. My gosh, this is advanced framing, isn't it? I thought that was a modern thing, that that just came up for discussion in recent terms with energy efficiency. Well, maybe that's not so old after all. All right, let's fast forward in time a little bit and let's hop into 1892 and let's look at the rest of the cities in the US. Because remember, the presidents could only enact things for the city of Washington. So this is a prize in my collection, 1892 Boston Building Code. And so this is where we see code being developed from a city government. And so who's doing that? Well, it's local politicians, right? And, I said I may ruffle some feathers with some tougher discussion in this, but that's how I roll. I'm a realist. This is a voted and elected position. Elected representatives that are leading cities, your mayors and whatnot, right? The city reflects their quality of politicking or whatever, right? How good of a politician they are is reflected in how great their city is. So, if your city is catching fire every few years and burning down, well, that's not making you look so good, is it? And so what's the motivation? What might be behind the scenes in motivating the development of these codes when they're written from folks that have to be worried about getting elected again and how nice their city looks in case they want to be a city manager or mayor of the bigger city nearby in town? Well, that'll be a tough job to get elected for when your town's burning down. The best thing about this book is opening up the beginning. And remember, this is history written in history. The words here were written in 1892, and they're writing a history of laws that start in 1679, where an act was passed. I wonder what the act was passed in Boston in 1679. Henceforth, no dwelling house shall be erected, set up, except of what? Stone or brick, and covered with what? Slate or tile. I mean, that's a sure way to look like a great mayor and be sure that your city doesn't burn down. Don't mind where the mechanics are all going to live, right? Well, if you continue to read through to this, it says the act did not seem to have been enforced. And so they passed another act after the Great Fire of 1760. Now, this act was said, okay, you cannot build out of wood or stone, has to be stone or brick, covered with slate or tile. But now they're going, as long as it's not more than 7 feet, stay under 7 feet in height. Again, trying to figure out how to allow construction with wood when your cities keep burning down. And what happened next? This act also doesn't seem to have been thoroughly enforced. And this goes on back and forth where they keep trying to create acts until finally what happens? Well, you have to create an enforcement arm of the government. So you can make sure that those mechanics that wanted that shelter, by gosh, you can work with them and figure out how they're going to get that shelter. And you see, this is the same thing that we have happening today. We have building codes that are moving forward and modernizing with lots of electrification and solar pre-wiring and all these things in the same towns that we have tent cities being erected and no enforcement of them. So this isn't a new problem. We've got lots of wood, and that's the most affordable thing for the mechanics to build out of. So this is fire safety, right? We've covered structural stability, guards, or gilt. You choose which one. And now we've talked about some fire safety. What other concerns of building codes might there have been? Well, I've got this prize from New York. And if you're looking for sanitation codes, plumbing codes, well, the term plumbing code is only going to take you so far. To go way back in history, you have to start searching the health department for health codes. And doesn't that give a clue of the intent and purpose of the origin of our concerns with plumbing? Our health, right? We're dealing with the need for potable water to put in our body, as well as the awful stuff that we send out of it. And so it was all wrapped around protecting society for their health. Now, this is 1881. And in the plumbing and drainage section in 1881, it said suitable drawings and descriptions of said plumbing and drainage have to be submitted and placed on file in the health department. They have to be reviewed and approved. 1881. Now, I want to pause and give you some pulse of 1881. In 1882, the Edison Electrical Illuminating Company in New York was formed and brought electric lights to Manhattan. So we are talking about the dawn of no longer lighting our homes with candles. That's how old we're talking. Have you guys ever seen the movie Gangs of New York? This movie was set in 1862. And those of you that have seen this movie will understand this joke. I do not want to be their plumbing inspector to turn down any of these guys' plumbing, nor would I have wanted to ask them to review and approve or submit plans. So I tell you, your plumbing inspectors were pretty tough back in this day. And if you haven't seen the movie, it's relatively violent, and it was actually an entertaining movie. So what else did we have? This is still in that health code for 1881. Heating, cooking, and illumination. And there was this crazy new concept coming along, fuel gas. And if we read right here, it tells us the use of gas for fuel and illumination have increased enormously within the last decade. And there's a general tendency among manufacturers and also among domestic users to employ gaseous fuel in preference to coal whenever practical or practicable. There was also some interesting language back in these old books. And so what I find interesting here is this speaks to society's expectations and their expectations changing as our technology and available resources were changing and expanding. But what we saw back in the past with code development is, like I said, with the IRC, we can maintain and still allow the older methods, make sure they're safe, make sure they're done correctly, safe, right, in a correct way, while still embracing the new methods. And so back then, to address society's expectations, we added provisions for this new gas to be able to keep it safe. Now, if we compare that to an example today, here's from December 2nd, 2020, an article in California where Oakland is banning now natural gas in new residential and commercial buildings. So we can see the evolution. I just showed you when natural gas was the new, cleaner, better thing to coal, but they didn't remove coal from the provisions. They understood that maybe the mechanics still needed that dirty coal, but the 1%, the newer, the better off folks could start to embrace these new and different technologies. And what you see kind of changed a little bit here is a little more now of a top down. Instead of responding specifically to society's expectations to say, hey, let's embrace some new concept of electrification, we see a little change in how code is handled, in that we see the banning of the old methods. So again, just some perspective. All right, so let's get back to fire, because man, fire was still just ravaging cities all across the US. And who really suffered? Well, obviously, I take that back. Who financially suffered? Well, the uninsured, I suppose. But you know who was suffering? The insurance companies. The National Board of Fire Underwriters was a collective of fire insurance underwriters all across the country, working together to try to come up with ways to reduce fire. If they can reduce the fires occurring in the US, they can reduce those massive payouts that they're subjected to when an entire city burns down. And that was really the focus. If you have a one-off fire here, fire there, it's an individual occurrence. The insurance companies can handle that. What they can't handle are when you have entire communities go under. So here we see now the first time that an organization that has no authority is now writing codes. And so notice the title. I bet a lot of contractors would love codes like this today still. A code of suggestions for construction and fire protection to safeguard homes and lives against the ravages of fire. This is from 1920. So in the early 1900s, the National Board of Fire Underwriters, my friends, did amazing, amazing things that I will share with you. And what they did is they, again, were the first group to start writing codes, but they themselves had no authority. They were writing the codes to try to reduce the fires for obviously, return on their investment reasons. But they had no authority. So they had to try to get the governments to then adopt these. And the way they did that was by paying for it. They footed the cost of the research, of the development, and all of the publishing and printing. And then they would give these code books for free to the governments that would not write their own, but that would utilize this. And this is also when we first see a standardized code, where the same code might be adopted by multiple cities. Now, I just had to add this in. I probably shouldn't have, because I'll run out of time, but this will give you a feel of how you can write code when you're an insurance company. This is about fire blocking, which I'm sure many of you should be very familiar with. Fire blocking has been troublesome for all the time, but here's a little passage of how it was written by the Fire Insurance Agency. The added cost of such protection is very slight, and yet its value is so little appreciated. The ordinary dwelling either has no fire stopping at all. It was called fire stopping, by the way, back then. Side tip, it was the 90s it got switched to called fire blocking. Or else the work is so indifferently done as to be practically worthless. Because such work does not show when a building is completed, and because its importance is usually entirely underestimated, it is common to delegate it to a boy or some careless, incompetent person. The result is that the fire stop is so in name only, it being merely a delusive imitation, which, if called upon to fulfill its purpose, fails completely. Such work does not require a high degree of mechanical skill, but is absolutely necessary that it be done by an intelligent, conscientious workman if it is to be efficient. Now, that's the kind of language you can get away with writing when you're an insurance company, and you can pretty much write whatever recommendations you want. I don't know about you, but I kind of feel sometimes like reading it that way to people today. I do feel like it was also written very poetically. I'm smiling. Hope you guys are. So here we have another example. This is not for dwelling houses. This is a commercial building code. And again, you see, what is it? It's recommended by the National Board of Fire Underwriters because they have no authority. And this was, my friends, I have lots of history, Pioneers of Progress, Men of Fire. There's some great books about the history of the National Board of Fire Underwriters and the NFPA. This was some amazing public-private, I wouldn't even say agreements. That's why I say benefit, because the National Board of Fire Underwriters didn't do this in any agreement. They did it. And then they said, look, we can provide you this guidance and we'll give you all these books for free. It'll help your communities and it'll help us. I think that's beautiful. So what else did the National Board of Fire Underwriters do? Well, you guys ever heard of Underwriters Laboratory? I mean, it's now been rebranded as just UL. But where did UL come from? Oh, gee, it was sponsored by the National Board of Fire Underwriters. Indeed, they paid that bill, and they encouraged the importance of the work that UL does in creating standards for all types of our products out there. And what else was happening in that time? Well, you had the birth of sprinkler systems in the late 1800s, and that is what brought together the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association. It's the sprinkler systems that brought them together because of all the issues with incompatibility in the various fittings in these sprinkler systems. You had volunteer fire departments, and so different cities had different threads and different types of fittings. And they would call a volunteer fire department from a neighboring city to come over and help with a massive conflagration, and they can't get any of the fittings to work together. Or maybe they need to get new parts for the sprinkler systems, and yet the neighboring town or the other state over there, they're manufacturing different types. And so the standardization of fire sprinklers is what brought together the National Fire Protection Association. But who funded it? The National Board of Fire Underwriters funded it, and they let the recommendations be by the professionals at the National Fire Protection Association. So you know what else you saw here? You saw people giving respect to fellow professionals, people staying in their lane, if you will. So the fire underwriters knew a lot about researching fires, but they didn't know as much as the professionals that were growing the National Protection Association. But who had the money? The underwriters. So they simply paid and allowed other professionals to help develop this. But look, they took the namesake. Take a look at this one. NBFU pamphlet number 13. 13. That might be familiar with some of you guys. That's our fire sprinkler standard, but now it's NFPA 13, and you have 13R and 13D. But what's the origin? Well, it was pamphlet number 13 of the NBFU. What was it? What else was born? Oh my gosh, we can thank the Board of Fire Underwriters also in the late 1800s and early 1900s for supporting the National Fire Protection Association in creating the NEC. And you see it again in this old NEC book of mine, sponsored and paid for by the Board of Fire Underwriters and recommended based on the professionalism and experience of the Fire Protection Association. And what do we see now? Now what we have is code drafted and developed from the fire industry. Now, of course, these organizations that lead the development of this had a very open door policy, had lots of people involved. All right, and so now we still have NFPA 70. And notice the same concept, right? It used to be NBFU number 70, and now it's NFPA 70. But what's another thing that we might be able to do to protect against fire? And this is where the NFPA, this is now something that was promoted and moved along by the NFPA, not the national board anymore. This after NFPA has been created. And NFPA says, hey, we're not just about protecting our dollar investment of having to pay back a burned down fire or city. We actually care about the human lives as well. And the National Board of Fire Underwriters did as well. I don't mean to say it that way. But what was realized is, maybe we can't put all the fires out. Maybe we also need to think about egress. And so in the early 1900s, I think it was like 1918, maybe was the first edition, a code called the Building Exits Code was developed. And this is the first time we started studying egress behavior from panicked occupants. How many exits do we need? How far apart can they be? And related obviously to that is a time factor. How quickly are these buildings burning down? And that's all part of the analysis that we still do today. Our buildings are burning down a lot faster. Our products inside of them, our finished materials are different. And as that changed, it changes the time that we have for folks to egress. Now, NFPA still does a lot of code. Obviously, NFPA is massively huge. They do have building code type things. They have their building construction and safety code and their NFPA 101 life safety code. These are not really the leading building codes that are adopted across this country. You do see some of these used in hospitals, but this is starting to get outside of what you guys are dealing with more would be, your residential. What I do want to point out is a really nice thing. Both, I should also mention this about UL, but I don't have a slide for them. Both UL and NFPA allow free access to read all their standards online for free. You don't have a copy of the NFPA 70 electrical code, NFPA 72 fire alarm code. You can read all these for free. I utilize this free viewing all the time. As much as I love my books, I only have so much money. All right, so let's move along a little further in time here. And let's see what started happening in the 1930s and 1950s. The U.S. Department of Commerce started getting involved in studying construction and creating, hey, look at this, recommendations, recommended minimum requirements for fire resistance. They have no jurisdiction over code. So the federal government, much like the National Board of Fire Underwriters, can only write recommendation books, suggestions. Now, why would they do this? And why the Department of Commerce? Well, you know what? The people. We, the people, started complaining to the federal government saying, these local cities and counties are going over the top with their building codes. Oh, brick or stone, right? They're not addressing the needs of the people. It's too expensive. And they went to the federal government and said, you've got to help do some research with all your money and help provide some recommendations. And so you see that here with fire resistance and with plumbing. So much exciting history with plumbing. That's such a nerdy statement, but welcome. My name's Glenn. All right, so also care and repair of the house. And then they put together all these other pamphlets. I have some other ones. Isn't this beautiful? Condensation control in dwellings. You think that's a new modern concept. That's from 1950. And the science of vapor management hasn't changed. All that's changed is all the material technology and the products that are available and the assemblies being designed. Water still works the same way in terms of condensing. And look, techniques of house nailing. Gotta love that one. That's a really neat one. All right, so 1927 rolls around and we get a whole nother new concept now. You know, who do you think really understands code and the expectations of safety, right? Fire safety and sanitation, but also understands the plight of your average, just American family? Well, it's the government workers. It's the building inspectors. They're just average government families too. They're just lowly, low-paid inspector government worker types. They have nothing to gain or lose from the code. You know, let me tell you, it's not a wealthy job, a high-paying job to be an inspector for a government. It's a great job, but it's not one if you're looking to buy, you know, having all your vacation homes. And so, again, who has a better pulse of the struggles of the people? Well, the authorities literally going to their homes and facing them face to face. The politicians aren't there, the presidents aren't there, the board of fire underwriters aren't there, but the inspectors are. And so for the first time, you get codes that are written from, again, somebody that's as close to the people and codes as possible, but also has nothing to gain from the creation of codes. And this concept holds through to today. This is a slide from the preface to the IRC, and it talks about how the IRC is maintained and redeveloped every 3 years. And what do we get? This statement: the ICC's governmental members, public safety officials who have no financial or business interest in the outcome, cast the final votes on proposed changes. And so that same concept has come today, theoretically the most non-biased folks. And for your excitement, that's literally happening right now. The online voting process, it's now an online process. So all of the building officials can have access to have a voice. That process is literally happening right now for the 2024 I-codes. So in that first code book, that first 1927 code book, remember I talked about motivation of the development of these codes, right? The president codes and the politicians codes, the insurance companies codes. And we know, not to demonize it, but we know we all have a reason, a motivation to do things. And so this is the preface of the 1927, and I've got to read this part to you. The conference has endeavored in the formulation of the code to serve no private or selfish interest, but to deal fairly with all in the effort to produce safe buildings for the greatest economy. Right? Recognizing the mechanics and the good of the public. It is true that everyone has a different estimate of just what is best. And in deciding these various issues combined in the code, it was necessary to draw upon a wide field of opinion. The final result represented is no doubt better than any individual opinion. I literally get tears when I read that. I actually made those quotes into my swag mouse pads that I give away to anyone with full enrollment at Building Code College. But I take these to the code hearings. I've been attending the code hearings, writing code proposals, arguing, testifying for the last 10 years. And what I now do is I bring big stacks of these, and this is basically my voting guide. It's sort of to remind all the folks at the hearings, no private or selfish interest. I think it's cool. All right. So this is the US now, right? We have ICBO starts in 1927. BOCA was actually formed first, but they didn't start writing codes until later. I think the 50s is when they started. And then SBCCI is Southern Building Code Congress International. So we had 3 code official organizations, again, inspectors, writing codes across this country. And then they, like the National Board of Fire Underwriters, they would try to get the governments to reference their code and say, all right, we're going to use your code in the same way they used to reference the Board of Underwriter codes. And so here we have the Uniform Building Code, the UBC. And over here, you've got the BOCA Basic Building Code. And it went through a couple name changes. And then you've got the Southern Standard Building Code down here. And depending on what part of this country you guys are in, you'll probably recognize some of these names. And so what might, remember, society's expectations, that's what this was all about. And so what kind of differences might we have? Well, I can tell you there was a bit of a theme in the expertise. This code had a lot more codes related to earthquakes, right? West Coast. And this code over here, Northeast, they had a lot more development of high-rise type codes. This is the original America here, right? This is where our massive growth is taking place. And so they had the early high-rise issues they had to deal with. And Southern Code, what did they have that was unique? Well, they had a lot of wind and hurricane, and then all the other bugs and humidity and heat and God knows what else you deal with in the South. I'm making fun of myself. I grew up in Texas. All right. And so they had kind of their individual specialties, but right, doesn't the public say that this is all about life safety? Isn't that what we hear all the time? Isn't that the message, the gossip out there? Building codes are for life safety. No, that's just part of it. And this might be a time to remember and remind you folks about civil conversations about difficult topics. And since this is kind of a one-way conversation, what I'm saying is, let's not demonize Glenn for bringing up difficult topics. The code, as I've said many times, is about society's expectations of the built environment. And life safety is, of course, one of those expectations. Let me introduce you to the Southern Standard Building Code that was adopted in Birmingham, Alabama in 1945. And my friends that appreciate American history may know that that's prior to the Civil Rights Act. And what kind of life safety and sanitation might be published in a building code? I'm not going to read it. I'll let you guys read it. Remember, this is for educational purposes only. And there's no more argument, I don't believe, that building codes have never been only about life safety. This is from 1945. And so as society's expectations change, thank God we change the code every 3 years, right? So we can get rid of our expectations of the past. And we'll have new expectations of the future to argue about, I'm sure. Here's a little taste of 2021 and how society's expectations for bathroom and bathroom signage is indeed changing. And we have this new exception where you no longer would have to provide separate facilities for both sexes. You can provide an all gender or multi-gender or multi-sex bathroom. Option in the code for those that would like to make that choice based on changing in society's expectations. All right, that was a tough subject to get through. So let's move on to post-World War II housing boom, right? Lots of folks coming back, lots of folks ready to have babies with their wives, and we had lots of homes being built. And so this is when we start to see building codes really start to focus more on dwelling house construction. That's what they called it back then, dwelling house. And so again, prior to this time, you had some suggestions for residential homes, but most of the residential provisions all started with tenement housing, and it was to protect your slumlords from abusing a tenant. You didn't get into single family rules, actual codes and regulation more prevalently until after the war, and we started building so many houses. So we see these little pamphlets that were created, and these were little pamphlets that were simplified versions of the full code to apply simply to houses. Well, if we fast forward further in society, right, we get corporate America, and we get bigger and bigger companies and bigger corporate home building companies. And these folks want to be able to have an architect design a house and build that house across the country. But they struggled with the fact that there were 3 code organizations. Now, what you're seeing here in 1971 is the original IRC. This is the first time ever we had a code book that included building, plumbing, mechanical, and this had references to electrical at this time. And what this was a major effort that was promoted by the industry, architecture, and home builders. The architects and home builders went after the 3 code organizations and said, guys, please come together with a simplified book just for homes that we can use across the US. And so you see those 3 organizations, BOCA, ICBO, and Southern. Who's that 4th one? What's that triangle? That's the National Board of Fire Underwriters, sort of, still playing a role in 1971. And this was just about the time of their exodus from this work. And again, massive thanks to what they did and helped promote in their public-private efforts back in the early 1900s. And so what we see here is National Building Code. And hey, check out that symbol again. There's that triangle symbol. That's the last one that they did in 1976. And what you can see here is that's the American Insurance Association. That's their little logo. And what do you see? Successor to the National Board of Fire Underwriters, right? They went out from just being fire insurance, and now we're in a part of the US where we're insuring more of our homes, right? We're insuring all kinds of things with our homes. And so now it becomes the American Insurance Association, and they step out of building codes by 1979. You can see here, there's no longer the triangle of the American Insurance Association, but a new logo. And this logo is CABO, the Council of American Building Officials. They put together this 1971 book as independence. And then they decided, let's form another nonprofit that is formed by our three organizations. And so they create CABO. And they continued to produce the CABO 1 and 2 Family Dwelling Code all the way through to a 1998 supplement. Okay, so here's where we start to see that concept of, can we get one code across this country written by the people that have the least bias? They're not politicians. They're not paying out the insurance bills. We're trying to make progress towards really good balance for the mechanics that need to build out of wood and for the 1%ers that can build with brick or stone. All right, so then we move on to today. Now we still have NFPA 70 by the NFPA, the National Electrical Code, and they own electrical code. So those three organizations I told you before do not develop electrical code. Since the early 1900s, when NFPA took this over from NBFU, it's still in the ownership, if you will, of NFPA. Now, up until the 95 CABO 1 and 2 Family Dwelling Code, this code gave you building, plumbing, mechanical, and then it referenced you over to NEC. Because remember, NEC was another organization, and they weren't yet playing along with these organizations. It wasn't until 1995 that an agreement was made where they could republish the NFPA codes just necessary for dwellings right into this code. All right, let's go back to plumbing and talk about plumbing. I told you plumbing had lots of exciting history. Now, in 1955, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, in response, remember, this is right after we had the federal government doing all that research, and we know plumbing codes are all across the board. Now, the Uniform Plumbing Code has already been started. So a couple of these, like IAPMO, some of these other groups had already started. But this is a sort of one-off code, the A40.8 from 1955. And you could say now we had engineers, mechanical engineers getting involved in leading the development of code. Now, this one's kind of funny. This is plumbing codes. These are plumbing codes between over less than a 10-year span from 1979 to 1987. Look at the amount of plumbing codes we have in this country. We had the International Conference of Building Official, we had IAPMO, we had BOCA, and they changed their name like 3 times. Southern Code was writing a plumbing code, and you have this one, the National Standard Plumbing Code. Not the National Plumbing Code and not the Standard Plumbing Code, but the National Standard Plumbing Code. They were running out of terms. Let's look at this one and see who wrote it. The Plumbing, Heating, and Cooling Contractors Association. So who else took a stab at writing codes? Contractors did. Hey, they have also kind of a firsthand experience with the mechanics across the country that are just simply trying to get their home warm again and might need, a minimum code. And so PHCC, they're still around. They've now made a partnership with ICC, and they are a player that's involved with the publication and development of the IPC and the IMC. And look, we see their logo back again. So it's great to see these organizations working together, ultimately for the benefit of the people and not to serve their own desires. And we can see the contractors are involved with some other things as well, like ACA. This is a standard, Manual J, Manual D, Manual S. This is all about sizing your heating and cooling systems, selecting equipment, and who gets to dictate the rules on this? The Air Conditioning Contractors of America. So they still have some control over this one. All right, moving along, let me bring you into 1979. That's when this book was published, and this is another prize of my collection. This isn't a code book, it's just an interesting research book. It is published by Congress of the United States, the Office of Technology Assessment, and we're now going to see again how code can come from the federal government. But hold on a minute, Glenn. I thought you said code couldn't come from the federal government. And that's why they could only make recommendations to try to get the local cities to relax a little bit. Well, that's still true. They tried a different approach. So this is the inside of that 1979 book, and it gives a lot of beautiful history on the birth of energy codes. And I'll read this part to you. Unfortunately, I'm going to run out of time. I typically do that to myself with these presentations. In 1975, Congress enacted the Energy Policy and Conservation Act. One of the numerous provisions of this measure is an authorization for funds to assist states in reducing the growth rate of energy consumption. States must initiate certain programs to get the money. The money. That's another way of recommending codes, isn't it? One of the requirements to get that money is the adoption of mandatory thermal efficiency standards and insulation requirements. And we go on to read further. This process led to the creation of the Model Code and launched a major federal initiative affecting local building codes. Exactly. And this is how the federal government now has an enormous influence on building codes. They are at the ICC hearings just like anyone else. Federal government reps would show up just like me if they wanted to change something at the International Code Council level. But when it gets to the governments choosing to adopt a code, they can dangle the carrots of greenbacks in front of them to help get the codes they want adopted. And my friends, this is still this is unchanged through to today. It's just the way it is. A lot of the consulting work I do to assist governments here in Colorado to upgrade to the next code, the funding comes from grants from the Department of Energy, and it's all focused on them updating their energy code. That's what they're after, but they can't update energy codes without updating all the rest of the codes. And that's where I get a lot of consulting work in assisting with that. And where's all the funding come from? It all started back here, and it's all about promoting the energy efficiency. And so we had this model energy code developed. I don't have the first edition. This is 83. But think about this. Society's expectations. Do you think this model energy code had society's expectations embedded in it? Or do you think it had the federal government's desires for society embedded in it? I think you know the answer, because we can open this 1983 and we see things like piping insulation, insulating your hot water pipes. But that didn't really take off. Or air leakage for buildings. Yes, in 1983, codes for sealing up air leakage and for air barriers. What wasn't really popular in the 70s with society, as well as air handling and duct system and insulating these. So the guidance and the motivation to enhance these energy provisions was there, but it did not come from society, and therefore it wasn't really embraced. Now we get the International Code Council formed in 1994, and you start to see a change now in the residential codes. This is just a fun little snapshot of how this evolved. Cable 1 and 2 Family Dwelling Code. The original ICC residential code was called the International 1 and 2 Family Dwelling Code. That's really the original actual IRC. And then we, of course, have the first edition in 2000. In all of these, remember I said electrical codes got embedded into the CABO code in 1995, but energy code was still separate. It was still this outlier. It was still this thing that really the federal government was all about trying to promote. It didn't come up through the grassroots way. It wasn't until the 2000 IRC that energy conservation provisions for the first time get included right in this book. And now we have every trade, electrical, plumbing, mechanical, and energy right in here. But some examples, right? It wasn't until 2009 that you saw vapor retarders for heated exterior pools be required. And then in 2012, it changed to say, okay, if 70% of that energy is coming from renewables, you don't need to cover. That first appeared, again, 2009, but not really, didn't first appear then. It was back in that model energy code by 1983 that, again, didn't really get widely embraced. Now, remember, the ICC, they just create books. The International Code Council, like the National Board of Fire Underwriters, has no governmental authority. They are just an organization that tries to put together the best recommendations to try to encourage governments to not write their own codes, but to adopt these. And so those three organizations came together, and now we have this one International Code Council. And again, I'll be quick. I just love this last quote. This is again from the 1927 UBC, where they say, fair constructive criticism and proper guidance will make the code much better through years of use and application, so that ultimately much good may result. Oh, sorry, I read the wrong part. But yeah, it says whenever they can improve it, they want to improve it, for it's not and never will be perfect. Why won't it ever be perfect? Because society's changing. That's why we got to keep chasing society. And that's what the code does. It follows society. Society gets new technologies, new ideas, new expectations. Then through a grassroots demand of society, we then see the proposals start coming to the code. And so code is a little delayed. Now, this is a quote I absolutely love. I don't know if I would tell it to your inspectors, that the code's not perfect. I'm not your average inspector. That was another little ha-ha.